Thanks so much, everyone, for joining. And the last session today will be about competition. The competition panel, we will touch on stuff that was, of course, discussed before. We will link to these things and enhance, expand, and likely dive a bit deeper. Allow me to briefly introduce the panelists. Let's start with David Lawrence. Again, alphabetical order of the first names. So David, you are the Policy Director for the Antitrust Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, where you oversee policy development at the division and supervise its appellate competition policy and advocacy and international sections. Great to have you here. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
Flavio, you're an economist working at the Directorate for Science, Technology and Innovation of the OECD, and you specialize in analyzing the role of innovation and technology in economic and social outcomes, which we'll also focus on today. You mostly take an empirical policy relevant perspective in your research, which is located at the intersection of innovation economics, digitalization, and business and employment dynamics, all of which obviously very important and critical when we talk about the consequences, economic consequences of generative AI. Thanks for flying in and joining us today. Chiara is not online. So Chiara had to cancel short notice. So thanks so much for joining us, and she might join us online in a second. Michal, you're a professor and director of the Center for Law and Technology at the Faculty of Law at the University of Haifa in Israel. In your research, you focus on the intersection of competition law and intellectual property law and technology, the impact of market size and regulation, as well as algorithms and big data. One of your concepts, I think we will mention, that you coined, we will mention today, the algorithmic consumer. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful, thank you so much. We will start with the opening remarks in a second. Again, the session will follow basically the same structure as the other session I moderated, slightly deviating from what Thibault did. So we have 5 minutes each. I would ask you to stick to the 5 minutes roughly, as good as you can. Then we will go into a moderated discussion where we also have a division into 2 topic areas. And then, of course, we will collect questions. And then it is a climax as such, the panel session, but then we will have bonus questions. And that will be, of course, a climax, I can promise that. So, okay, let's start with the opening statements, and I give the floor to David. David, can you please start?
Yes, please. Happy to. And first of all, thank you so much for having me here. Wish I could be with you in person today, but heading off on our spring break tomorrow. So it was this conference with you all or a cruise with my family. So we'll see if I pick correctly. It looks like a great event. I should also say at the outset that I'm here in my personal capacity, and the views I express don't necessarily reflect those of the department. Okay, so we're focused here on competition in generative AI. At the Antitrust Division, we're very interested in promoting competition. And one of the things I did with the essay is sort of step all the way back to what it is we're trying to achieve there. Because I will say, I've heard a number of these sorts of discussions, and I think it is very easy to get into the mindset of trying to map out the AI ecosystem and then have little boxes for like how many competitors there will be in each, and essentially be painting a picture of what this market should look. And I guess I take as a starting point that is not a particularly productive exercise for a government or regulatory authority, because competition is an incredibly unpredictable process. Innovation is an incredibly unpredictable process. And so our focus ought to be on ensuring the conditions are such that they'll be conducive to that process proceeding well. I think of this less as trying to predict exactly what kinds of flowers will grow in this garden, and thinking more about what levels of sunlight and making sure there's enough water, making sure that competition will play out productively. And in an innovation, in a market characterized or an ecosystem characterized by a lot of innovation, I think a particular priority when we think about the conditions for competition should be on ensuring the conditions for competition and innovation by disruptors. We know we want innovation by disruptors. And we know, there's tremendous debates, and there's lots of literature on this on all sides about what levels of market concentration best foster innovation as a general matter. I think that there's a debate there as to incremental innovations, but that the record is clear that disruptive innovations tend to be made by outsiders, tend to be started with smaller firms, and they tend to be discouraged relatively by your most dominant firms who have a stake in the status quo, because the stake in the status quo discourages disruption. And that actually brings me, the essay is about lessons we can learn from the telecom industry and the history of telecom regulation. And we have a lesson in the United States there. One of my favorite stories is what I think of as the inventor of the first wireless phone in the United States was a rancher. His name was Carter. It was called the Carter phone. And he wanted to be able to use his home phone when he was riding his horse around, chasing the cattle. And so he essentially strapped a walkie-talkie of the era to his AT&T monopoly landline telephone. And he kind of wired them together, and then he took the other walkie-talkie out in the field. He iterated on this, and he wound up creating a sort of effective wireless device that could allow you to travel with a phone. AT&T shut that down, right? The monopolist shut that down, and Carter wound up spending, I think, over a decade in a regulatory battle with the Federal Communications Commission. Now, a contrast I'll bring you. After the department broke up AT&T, so even the local, the landline monopoly was broken up into multiple parts of the United States. Each of those, we called them the baby bells, each of those remaining companies became rather innovative in wireless. And they moved into wireless telephony with a lot of series of innovations, not just in the places they were already monopolies, but throughout the rest of the country as well. And so that's part of why in the United States now, our largest cell phone carriers, this is true in a number of other places, are the descendants of these local telephone companies. And I think that's an example of where competition at what otherwise could be a gatekeeper level, a chokehold level, can foster innovation. There are a few other corollaries in the paper that, in the interest of time and to keep to my 5 minutes, I'll just mention really quickly. I think that generative AI appears likely to develop with some significant fixed costs along the way. When you think about the chips and computing resources, I think you can think of them analogously to other industries with a lot of sort of investment in time and money. I doubt it'll be as extreme as in telecommunications, and yet we see multiple equally high quality providers often able to support having the separate investment in those fixed costs. So I see there's some hope for a competitive AI ecosystem. I also think we've had good luck with having many providers and yet using thoughtful government regulation to promote security across all of the disparate providers. And so I think that competitive markets are going to be very conducive to security regulation. And in fact, our AT&T experience in the United States underscores that a monopoly firm can be kind of difficult to regulate, particularly in an important product or service area. And so another reason to encourage competition there. And then, one other sort of broad set of principles I mentioned, sunlight and water for this garden. I think that interoperability and non-discrimination principles played a really important role in competition in telecommunications as it developed, and likely have a significant role to play here. With that, I'll pause and look forward to the other panelists.
Thank you very much. That was, I really enjoyed your article, and also having this sort of the lessons learned from a specific sector and try to see where it fits or maybe doesn't fit, and identify, explore to what extent this should inform, can inform approaches for policy and regulation in a Gen AI context. It's very valuable. Thanks so much. And we move to Flavio. And Flavio, you and your co-author Chiara, who can't be here, unfortunately, you zoomed out a bit. You looked into the economic consequences of Gen AI and also provide a lot of evidence, which I appreciate also a lot, because I think it's very helpful as a resource, right, to have an article that basically summarizes and analyzes that. So please.
And thank you very much for the opportunity. Let me also say, also in view of the bonus question, that also whatever I say represents my personal views only and does not represent necessarily the views of the OECD. So with Chiara in this piece, we look at generative AI and link with productivity. And we try and do so focusing a little bit on the literature, zooming a bit out, starting but what do we know about the link between AI and productivity, and then focusing on the few studies that at the moment analyze directly the links between generative AI and productivity, and then we do a more speculative discussion about the challenges, especially the policy challenges, and we conclude by looking a little bit at what future research can say about that. So starting a little bit about the literature that looks at the link between AI and productivity. So we work a lot on microdata, and especially the official microdata, the commercial microdata. When you measure these things, they have a little bit of a lag. So the evidence is just emerging, and at the OECD we have done quite a bit of work using different sources of data, and hopefully I'll have the chance to expand a little bit on that, looking at AI and the characteristics of the users and the link with productivity. But in a few words, what emerges from this research is that artificial intelligence, before the boom in generative AI, so this is what the data can tell us until now, basically, is used by firms that are typically in the ICT and in professional services. Their firms are typically, to some extent, large. Some of them are young. When you look at productivity, these firms tend to be more productive. So the AI users tend to be more productive than other firms, but the productivity premium do not seem that they can be credited entirely to the use of artificial intelligence, because there are other assets that are complementary, such as the use of other digital technologies, the skills, the digital infrastructure, that when taken into account appear to explain a large proportion or play an important role in this productivity premium. So this was a little bit to set the stage, and then we focus more directly at the most recent literature that looks at the links between generative AI and productivity. And here, there are two streams of evidence basically that are available at the moment, and one focuses more closely on exposure of occupations to artificial intelligence. So there are a few papers. One key reference is by Felten and others, where they basically look at occupational dictionaries, at the tasks that are within occupation, and the extent to which these occupational tasks are exposed to artificial intelligence. And what basically this says, there are a few other papers, but the key thing is that there are a number of cognitive occupations, also high-paid occupations that are highly exposed to artificial intelligence, and that a large share of jobs in the United States have at least a portion of their tasks exposed to AI. So this is a first bit of the literature. Second bit is the study that really look at the links between generative AI and productivity. And these are basically experimental studies. So typically, you have two groups of workers. One is treated, is given access to some large language model. The other is not, and the authors compare the outcome. The key findings here of this stream of literature is basically that generative AI tends to have a positive effect on the productivity of workers. It allows them to complete tasks quickly, more efficiently, and this appears more evident for the lower skilled workers, so workers that tend to have lower experience when the tasks carried out by workers are within the capabilities of the AI systems. So these are the two key findings on the literature, and then building upon that, we present a more speculative policy discussion, and here we think it's relevant to distinguish between developers and users of artificial intelligence, and we highlight the different policy challenges between developers and users, touching upon some that have been already discussed. For instance, for developers, those related to IPR, competition challenges, but also environmental challenges related to the environmental impacts of training and deploying large language models, while for, and others, I'll probably elaborate a little bit more later. For users, again, IPRs, but also hallucinations, uncertainties, and the extent to which these models can be used in business models. A key role in all these contexts is played by skills, and hopefully I'm gonna come back to this point a little later, so I will not anticipate that too much, so I try to stick in the 5 minutes that I'm not sure how this is going, but well, then, about skills I'm gonna come back later, just to say a few words about the, and also about possibly the policy challenges and the role of policymakers. Just a few words about possible future research. These studies can be expanding into several directions, especially when the data available also at the administrative level would allow to measure more directly the extent to which firms are using generative AI and the role of complementary assets, including skills.
Thank you very much. We will certainly come back to the skills aspect, and probably this will be also something that is very relevant to the audience here. Yes, so Michal, you have a different focus. Today we learned a lot about the supply side and the economics of supplying specific inputs for Gen AI and so on. You focus more on the demand side. And you explore the transformative role of LLMs as intermediaries that are basically capable of reshaping in a way the competitive landscape, or we will discuss this, how they or whether they can do this. If I understood correctly, is a truncated algorithm consumer concept coined in your NLR, Network Law Review paper? I mean, it would be this, like JSON's hypercapability, concept number 2 that is new.
Let me start by saying, thanking you for organizing such a wonderful event. And I am well aware that I'm missing all the fun by not being able to join in person. And you're right that most of the studies of the competitive effects of Gen AI focus on the supply side. And what we decided here is to focus on the demand side and the use of LLMs by consumers as part of a 3-step process where the user, first of all, uses the LLM in order to seek information on a product or a service. And then the LLM acts as an intermediary, or as you just said, a truncated algorithmic consumer, and the consumer then makes his decision. And then we ask 3 related questions. First, we ask, can the use of the LLM lead consumers to make better decisions by enabling them to better search? And in this sense, we indeed use the concept of a truncated algorithmic consumer. And you're right, this is something we use for the first time in the article that we wrote for the Network Law Review. And the way to think about algorithmic consumers is that they have 2 main characteristics. The first is that they automate some of the important aspects of consumption. And most algorithmic consumers assist consumers only in some parts of the consumption act, but some can also lead them all the way to the ultimate decision that the consumer makes. And so we call truncated algorithmic consumers those who only perform certain tasks. And you can think about LLMs as the one that assist in search. And the second condition for an algorithmic consumer is that it acts in a fashion that furthers the consumer's welfare rather than the suppliers or the intermediaries' welfare. And this is a point I will get to maybe later in the discussion today. So if you think about what LLMs can do, they can significantly reduce search and transaction costs. They can help consumers overcome some of their biases. They can enable more sophisticated choices. And but another question that should be asked here is, how different are they from traditional search tools? Because we know that traditional search tools can perform some of these acts as well. So we actually show in the article how LLMs are different from the traditional search tools and how that affects the market dynamics. And then we analyze some of the competitive concerns regarding generative AI. And in particular, we focus on 2. We focused on one which is based on content homogenization, where the LLM, because of their features, would often choose the word that comes up most in the data set. And we show that that has effects on choosing, for example, a washing machine that was just introduced into the market and it doesn't appear many times in the data set. And then we focus on the potential for manipulation and for gaming of LLM models. And we focus on 3 types of gaming: by the user, by the intermediary, and by the supplier. And actually going back to the first panel of today, when there was a lot of discussion regarding the ecosystem that exist here, a combination of an LLM model with a data set on consumers' digital profiles might potentially create a strong nudging mechanism. And we actually claim that it might change a simple dark pattern into a personalized enhanced nudge and changing consumer choice architecture. I can talk about that more later. And the third thing that we do in the article is that we analyze how LLMs affect market dynamics and entry barriers for new competitors. And I should say that this is the first step in wider empirical research that we're performing. We're testing different LLMs, we're asking different questions, and we are trying to see what they bring to the consumer, whether indeed all of them or some of them, or what are the features that in more instances focus the consumer towards goods that were used in the market for a long time rather than new ones.
Thank you so much, Michal, for this first pitch. And I think it shows how complementary this panel is as well. So I think we will have a very interesting discussion here. We move to the first part where we look into the economic consequences or implications of Gen AI, and start with Flavio. And basically connecting to what you said before a bit, like perhaps can you provide a bit more detail how the benefits of Gen AI are distributed? They are distributed probably rather unevenly across various sectors, job roles, geographic areas, individuals. Are there specific industries or contexts, if you will, where the influence of Gen AI is particularly beneficial, challenging, or disruptive? So healthcare, finance, education, manufacturing, or so on.
Thank you. So one of the points of reflection around the questions is the extent to which generative AI has probably the characteristics, or at least has the potential of being a general purpose technology. General purpose technology, which means that it has the potential of have applications in a great part of the economy, so across many industries, and considering the literature, it appears to have some of the characteristics that characterize that, including the fact that it improves fast over time, that has a wide range of applications across many sectors, and that can postpone innovation in different sectors. So we have heard a number of examples around the creative industry, of course, in education, in many of the services industries, which are where generative AI has the highest exposure. If you look at this exposure indicator, I would probably take the context questions, which allow me to highlight a little bit what I was mentioning before about the skills. So the current studies are focusing on different industries, different case studies, and they've looked, for instance, at software developers, at programmers, therefore, at management consultants, at mid-level professionals, or at customer support agents. So these are different examples coming from different industries. And one of the findings that returns a little bit in the literature, beyond the increase, the fact that generative AI is associated with an increase in the productivity of these workers, it's that the lower skills, so those that have less experience, that have that are on the lower part on the skill distribution, appear to have significant significant benefits from generative AI. So this is something that that can have pros and cons in the sense that, of course, the fact that lower skilled workers benefit the most is something relevant. On the other hand, one of the let's say, this literature currently focuses on more on the short-term effects. So on the extent to which one using generative AI can do tasks more efficiently and faster. When taking things from a longer-term perspective, I think, and what we also mention in the article, is that things like critical thinking would be crucial in order to understand, for instance, when to use generative AI, so when the current capabilities of the generative AI systems allow some productivity improvements, how to use generative AI and how to leverage its benefits, limiting the potential, the skilling, and leveraging, augmenting, improving the absorptive capacity of workers, which is something that in the longer run is something that is important for productivity growth on the longer run. So yes, one example is about I was mentioning is about code and software developers. Another point that is not yet examined that may be relevant in this sense is the extent to which the use of generative AI differs when workers are interacting among each other, and this is something that may be perhaps something relevant for the future to see what the future studies will tell us about.
Thank you very much. I mean, certainly there's much more room for research, and of course, as these technologies evolve, as we sit here, there probably is lots of potential for not only comparative studies and sector studies and occupational studies, but also like longitudinal insights on that. Let me follow up on this generally. Of course, you mentioned this term general purpose technology, which is, as a matter of fact, called GPT, like the chat GPT, but it's not that GPT. Which might be confusing to some. And of course, we know that in the field of like ICT, generally speaking, measuring, quantifying the economic impact of ICT has been, say, notoriously complex. And we know the Solow paradox. There's Brynjolfsson et al. Have this production mismeasurement J-curve. How do these measurability issues play a role? How do you assess them, and how do you think do they intersect with considerations related to estimating or assessing the impact on competition?
Yes, so this allows me to link a little bit with the different works that we have done recently at the OECD, indeed on measuring the digital transformation, measuring from different perspectives the use and adoption of digital technologies by firms, and the links with productivity, which are at the center of the two quotes that you had. The computers can be everywhere, but not in the productivity statistics. That's on the Solow paradox, and the role of complementary investments in intangible assets that may be required before the productivity returns materialize. And this is about the J-curve. So in the past few years, we have taken different perspectives to try and leverage the potential of available data, and in particular microdata, so data with very detailed information about the firm level, about big data, to look at how artificial intelligence is used. And we have looked at, for instance, the job postings by firms and those firms that require AI-related jobs. We have looked at firms' website and AI keywords in AI website. We have looked at patent data and the extent to which, what are the characteristics of core AI technologies. And we have looked at administrative, so surveys carried out by national statistical offices, as well as commercial big data, to look at the link between AI and productivity. This tends to be before generative AI, but still you'll see in a second probably how the implication of these are relevant, because as I was mentioning before, we see that firms that use artificial intelligence appear more productive, but there is a key role of other assets, other digital technologies, skills, and the digital infrastructure that importantly play a role in explaining and in driving these productivity premium. And the role of these complementary assets, as I was mentioning before, is gonna probably remain key also in the world of generative AI, because at first sight, one may think that you may need less complementary technologies because you just need a computer, you can write a prompt, you get the reply, and that's it. But still, especially issues related to skills and the critical thinking would be crucial in order to leverage the benefits of generative AI, as I was mentioning before, also on the longer run. To link it a little bit with competition, we have some studies that show, so I was mentioning the general case where firms tend to be more productive, but when accounting for complementary assets, this premium goes away. But in some cases, and in particular for firms that develop their own AI systems, so AI developers, we do see some positive effect of the use of AI on productivity. And here the point is that taking a little bit a broader perspective, the longer run trend reflect or highlight both a slowdown in productivity growth, but also an increasing divergence between the best performing firms and the rest. And Chiara, that has now connected, that has been at the forefront of this research. The point is to the extent to which AI may increase productivity of firms at the top, then these divergences may increase over time. You can think about maybe because the firms that are already at the top have the skills or have the data or have the resources to leverage more the benefits of AI. And so this is one possible challenge, is to link it a little bit in terms of competition.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Very nice insights here. And Chiara, welcome. Good to see you. Not see you yet, but have you here on the call. Feel free to chime in if you want.
Sorry, I'm here, so I don't know if you can hear me. Just I think Flavio said it all very well, so I don't have anything to add except that there is a lot of work that we are doing using all sorts of data, and Flavio mentioned some, and I think more work can be done on one of the things that Flavio mentioned, which is AI and concentration, but I would say also on the upstream sectors underlying AI, which is the sort of the whole semiconductors for AI, which, as you know, is a very well concentrated sector as well. And so we're also looking into semiconductors and how this sector is changing and how it can affect the development of AI for productivity and for, you know, generative AI in the next few years. So this is something that is in the making as well.
Excellent, very important work. So we can't wait, of course, to have you folks share with us the insights from this research. Now, coming back to Michal. Michal, you mentioned that LLMs can or have a capacity to enhance consumer decision making. Now, could you elaborate on the mechanism through and the context in which LLMs can empower consumers in that direction and thereby not only like reducing search costs or so, but generally speaking, enabling them to counterbalance, to some extent at least, the algorithmic power, if you will, of suppliers?
Okay, let me start by saying that, as I show in previous work done with Niva Elkin-Koren, algorithmic consumers hold the potential to assist consumers in three main ways. One is, of course, to assist them in making more informed decisions. The second is limiting the ability of suppliers to discriminate if the algorithmic consumer works as a buffer between the supplier and the consumer. And the third is the ability to create a joint buyer power if it enables buyers to join together. Now, when we take this concept to LLMs, they provide only the first of these three benefits. However, we also show that in doing so, they bring to the table some benefits beyond what we see in traditional search. So LLMs can better intermediate the vastness of online information to consumers. And let me give you some of the arguments here. First of all, they can be likened to a librarian versus a stochastic parrot, because whereas common search models such as Google provide links, LLMs provide full answers without any need to delve deeper unless the user wishes to ask a follow-up question or wishes to see the links. They also change the nature of the human-computer interaction, basing it on a conversational use, which is closer to the smartphone's personal assistants, if you will, which makes it easier and more user-friendly for many more lay persons to use. And another difference is that the new interface of chat-like LLMs can impact consumer trust in the AI recommendations in ways that non-interactive search engines will struggle to create. And LLMs can also create a multitude, they can balance a multitude of factors as required by consumers in their queries. Just think about looking for a hotel room and balancing things like budget and brand preference and certain features like closeness to a certain area. The LLM can often tailor the answer better than a simple search engine. They're also based on feedback because the user can give direct feedback to the generative answer. And LLMs are language models, and so they're capable of conducting data analysis tasks and analyze, such as, for example, analyze pricing trends. So if you ask when might be the best time to buy a plane ticket, they might be able to give you a better answer than traditional models. So all these come together. They are not always existent in all LLM models, but they are potential. And so they create a better basis for consumer choices.
Thank you. If I may follow up there right away. How do you assess this and the impact of LLMs, given that they have obvious limitations in their capabilities and that their capabilities constantly evolve? Can you maybe give your thoughts on that?
Definitely. I would, sorry. I think it's important when we talk about LLMs also to, and their ability to affect consumer decisions. I think it's equally important not to focus only on the benefits, but also on the limitations or on the downsides. And let me just mention a few. First of all, of course, is what we know about hallucinations. However, there I'm a bit less worried, because if you are looking to buy a product that does not exist, you're not going to be able to buy it. So at least with regard to some kinds of information, hallucinations might be less important. But I think it's another important limitation depends on the data set and what's in the data set. Because LLM models are trained to seek the most plausible next word. And this feature of LLMs provides more mainstream answers, leading to what researchers, including Michal Schur-Ofri, call outcome homogenization. And LLM provide answers that are likely to be geared towards the popular and reflect the mainstream answers. Just think about a consumer which is seeking the best washing machine. And so if the data is mostly historic data, the most plausible answer will be based on the best washing machine that existed in the time frame, during all the time frame, or most of the time frame, that the data set relates to, rather than a new one that was just introduced into the market. So the result depends on the data set, whether the data set includes enough new text to alter the answer. It also depends on how the consumer structures this question. For example, a consumer requests only new answers, and whether the model in its predictive function uses a user's previous revealed preferences. And so this creates an ingrained pull of the algorithm towards mainstream answers. And it's a direct result from the technological features. And it's not a bug in the code, it's actually a feature. And it could have adverse competitive effects by hiding the much needed information for consumer choices, limiting the ability of newcomer firms and best offers to be recognized. And if you think about it, this is exacerbated by some of the features of LLMs, for example, and the ecosystems in which they operate. For example, the limited digital literacy with regard to how LLMs make decisions, the fact that they're general purpose technology, and so that if they generate good answers in one sphere, they might create a trust in other spheres, even if that trust is not justified. They might create echo chambers that result from feedback loops, whereby the text generated by LLMs percolates back into the data set. And they also distance the consumer from the source materials. The consumer does not see the picture of the product. It does not choose between the links. It only gets one answer most of the time. So these are some of the main considerations here.
Thank you very much. Sounds like lots of like entry barriers that are potentially arising from this, and also path dependencies in a way, right? Yeah, new forms of path dependencies, yeah. So let's move to, thank you very much. Let's move to David. And David, in your contribution, we said that you draw an analogy between telecoms and Gen AI. You explain unique challenges posed by Gen AI, accelerated innovation cycles, distinct self-reinforcing data network effects, different forms of feedback loops. Now, what I found very interesting was about like business models and content creation. So your discussion points to new paradigms of value generation and extraction, if you will, which raises questions about the changing economics of content creation and compensation as well. And thus also in a way for competition. Now, broadly speaking, I would say in my own words, Gen AI leverages pre-existing data and content, right? So we've learned this in Jan's presentation and his pitch as well. Data was generated before the conception of Gen AI technologies, and thus without any anticipation of its use by Gen AI applications. So the creation of this content was decoupled in time and purpose from its actual use through Gen AI, and the incentives for content generation stemmed from other contexts. I think that's clear just to see here. So yet again, of course, several Gen AI business models rely on this data to basically create value and monetize that. Creators often remain uncompensated. Now, this may have profound implications on incentives, investment, and innovation in content production. And could you elaborate on the consequences of Gen AI's first reliance on pre-existing content and data, and second, its novel capabilities to produce synthetic content at scale? And how does this impact on incentives for human content creation, and as an outcome, perhaps as well, a very different signal-to-noise ratio? Sorry, David, for this long question.
That's great, and it's such an interesting topic. You use the word decoupled. If I could pick one from the question, which I think underscores a very significant difference from telecommunications platforms, right? So in telecom, the more users are calling, the more users, the network effects grow and the value is generated, right? But the telecom network is essentially acting as a passive pipe, and there's an inherent exchange of value in every phone call, right? That's sort of this reality we've been used to. And even in modern platforms like a social network, the value of exchanging photos happens to both sides at the same time, right? What we're talking about, you could think of as a type of multi-sided platform where one of the sides is the creation of content by human beings, as you said, at a time and place distinct from the questions of use in generative AI. And then the other sides of the platform are, whether it's users or other types of apps, are extracting and enjoying the value of that, right? But in contrast to most platforms, that second step could risk cannibalizing the first step. So the first step of content creation, instead of seeing greater value, this depends a lot on how the ecosystem develops, but instead of seeing greater value, the content creation side of this platform could see its own value diminished the greater that the platform is used. And so I think this is a risk we should be very conscious of, because we can't rely on generative AI for everything. In fact, it's a little bit of a misnomer. The AI isn't generating anything new. It's more of a revisionary combiner. It is revising and combining things it found, right? It's not a brand new picture. It's a combination of pictures that it has read into its system. And so it's going to need people to develop pictures. It's going to need people to produce content. It's going to need scientists to determine the shapes of proteins in order to continue to generate incremental value. A thought experiment that I use here is if we didn't have copyright law, like if tomorrow we canceled copyright law, we would see an explosion in content creation for a short time, right? For a short time, I would be out there creating my own Scrooge McDuck, or maybe I would write Back to the Future 4. I've always wondered what's going to happen, right? And I could go get people to produce that, and that would be a wonderful thing. Maybe you would all enjoy what happens in Back to the Future 4. But the next Back to the Future type innovation by a group of humans would never occur, because in the long run, the copyright protection is necessary to drive that investment, right? And so it's not clear what timescale this will play out in with respect to generative AI, but there is a risk that part of what we will see, if we don't have a way to recouple what you appropriately described as a decoupling and ensure value is passing back up to human creators, we don't have a way to do that. We risk seeing a short-term explosion followed by a collapse in human innovation.
Thank you very much. Actually, that reminds me of the work of Jaron Lanier, who owns the future, I guess, in 2015 or even earlier, about basically not being the customer but the product. And then, of course, lots of research that has been basically ignited, I think, through this about human-centric data economy and these things. Thank you very much. Let's go a bit to the second round of let's say, questions, if you will, coming back to Flavio. And, well, you basically explained the productivity effects you discuss in your article as well, things like market concentration, role of first mover advantage, and so on. But you also, and I quote here, say, policymakers can play a critical role to foster an inclusive and sustainable digital transformation in the age of generative AI. So what do you perceive as the most urgent challenges policymakers need to tackle, and what actions or considerations should be prioritized by policymakers to, one, ensure that the development and deployment of Gen AI technologies align with ethical standards and societal values, including probably sustainability aspects, and two, foster competition. Coming back to the competition panel.
Yeah, so it's a challenging question, and probably it could be useful to frame it a little bit, to consider different layers, different groups of firms, also to frame the different policy challenges that can be relevant for the different groups. And one of the groups we have talked about them quite a bit today is those that are the developers, the firms that are training and maintaining the AI systems, where there are a number of inputs, including data, the computing resources that are required to train the models, the fact of the scaling, that increasing the number of parameters, the performance increases. We have been mentioning this as well today, the availability of skills and the cost to train and maintain the models, that are forces that point towards, at least to some extent, concentration on this side. On the use, so this as one of the key challenges here. On the using side, probably can be useful to distinguish two different margins: the incumbents and the new entrants. And on the incumbent side, so the challenge, I was mentioning this a little bit, may be related to the extent to which generative AI may favor firms that have already a more established position vis-a-vis others, due, for instance, to a number of inputs of the skills of the data that they may possess vis-a-vis others. There are certainly other challenges that we discuss also about them in the papers, and we have talked a bit about those earlier, about IPRs that are relevant actually for the two groups. While on the entering side, one of the things that occurs often when new technologies arise is that the new technology may bring disruption, and the entrants may apply the new technology using and developing new business models. And so this may be a force that can, let's say, bring innovation to the extent to which the technology can be applied and used and accessed by this group of firms. The ethical aspects and the sustainability aspects are transversal, and they touch upon both groups of broader layers and groups of firms that we have discussed about. On ethics, in one of the studies that the OECD has recently carried out, we look a little bit at the job postings and the extent to which we focus on AI-related job postings and the demand for AI-related jobs. And the authors find that there is a very limited number of these postings that contains keywords related to ethics, with sustainability being a challenge both on the development side, so on the training of these models, but also on the extent to which these are used, the prompts, etc. The biggest the size, also on the using side, probably this is also related to the sustainability concerns. And this is an area on the twin transition and the mix between green and digital, the link between green and digital, where we are working on closely with ongoing work. In terms of policy, regulation would remain critical in promoting a use of AI that is innovative and trustworthy, and that remains ethical and respects human rights and democratic values. And in this context, the OECD has led efforts in leading, in bringing intergovernmental standards on AI, with notably since 2019 with the AI principles that focus on the responsible stewardship of trustworthy AI, human-centered value, fairness, transparency, accountability, robustness, security, and safety. And based on these principles, key recommendations for policymakers include investing AI in research, in AI research and development, fostering a digital ecosystem. So this is related to the access of the inputs that we have seen as critical also for both for the development and deployment of AI systems, shaping and enabling policy environment and building human capacity. So again, skills, the skills that may be relevant both on the development side, but also on the user side, and promoting international cooperation for trustworthy AI.
Thank you very much. Ambitious, but we might get there. Thank you very much. David, so You mentioned in your article, you discussed, of course, the parallels, similarities, differences, and the vertical aspects, vertical integration, vertical control played a role. You mentioned choke points and bottlenecks. One short question here, and this is, I think, unsurprising that this comes up. We are economists here, and we discussed this morning already. Focusing on regulatory strategies to address bottlenecks, maintain competition, and foster innovation. Like, what is your stance on the necessity for proactive ex-ante measures, such as specific competition rules or regulatory actions versus more reactive ex-post interventions, given, of course, also the dynamism and the evolvability of the technology that is basically considered?
Sure. I think that I don't think that there is an innate benefit to ex ante versus ex post. I think they're both types of approaches, and in specific situations, one or the other is going to be best, and one or the other is going, or maybe both will be best, right? I do think that we are in a time of early development of this ecosystem, and that is actually somewhat counterintuitively can be a good time to think about ex ante, whether it's formal regulatory interventions or establishments of norms, because early, before companies have massively invested in building out their businesses and structuring them, and the business models have developed, it's much less costly for firms to comply with a set of norms that we think may be conducive to competition in the long run, so that we avoid a complicated and costly regulatory intervention later. So I think that, on some things, ex ante regulation can be helpful. As to ex post, the enforcement side, I think the highest priority needs to be quick movement. I think that, we have different types of ex post enforcement in, across our histories, and the sooner enforcers move with the more surgical of the interventions, I think often the more effective. It can be very difficult to solve these problems when they're fully entrenched.
All right, thank you very much. Very last question for Michal. Quick question, Michal, and this is basically connecting to what you said before and what you explained before about the output homogenization and the basically effects on the impact of the truncated algorithmic consumer. Which empirical strategies can you think of would be best to measure these things? And maybe you can give us a sneak preview of what you're working on at the moment.
I'm sorry, I missed your last sentence.
Maybe you can give us which empirical strategies would you think of in assessing the impacts of basically the algorithmic effects, LLMs, that you basically explore and describe, and whether you could give us a sneak preview perhaps in some projects that are already underway.
Yeah, that's a great question, and let me relate to some of the parameters here, because the impact to competitive dynamics is affected by many factors, and we're looking at several. So let me suggest a few. So if you look at the consumer side, or the consumer conduct, one question to ask is how many actually use the LLMs in order to choose products. Another one is the level of trust of a layperson in the suggestion that the LLM provides. And another one, you might think about, for example, the extent of multi-homing between traditional search algorithms and LLMs, or between LLMs. I'm not even sure that many of the traditional search algorithms are going to be around, because they are all combining LLMs. And then you can think about the supplier conduct and look at different parameters. For example, what is the data set? What is the volume? What is the velocity of the data that each LLM is using? And I think this is important because it might lead in opposite directions. If you have better data and parameters, you might overcome homogeneity and limiting higher access barriers. But on the other side, if you have a better data set, you might have a bit of market power. And if you have market power, that might lead to better ability to manipulate the consumer in different ways. So what we're going to try and see on that first level is what kind of answers are generated with simple answers, and then with more sophisticated answers, and then with feedback with regard to different LLMs, and see how consumers react to that.
Thank you so much. Now, of course, again, we have some time for you folks to ask your questions to the panelists. Please go ahead, don't be shy. Thibault, can you take this microphone? Maybe Stephen was first, at least Ela and Wolfgang next.
Thank you. This is primarily a question for David with the telecoms parallel. I'd just like to double tap on that because, you know, as you'll appreciate, there's more and more emphasis on interoperability as a freestanding doctrine, not only in terms of what it does. You know, historically, you mentioned Back to the Future, if we had a time machine, then we would go back and find no freestanding interoperability, or at least not dominantly, whether it's EU, US, or UK antitrust law. There would be a focus on consumer outcomes chiefly. Now we see more and more emphasis on interoperability as a freestanding doctrine. For instance, though I'm sure you can't comment on it, your ad tech case might result in such an intervention. Thinking in a UK context, the DMCC bill, which is almost certain to pass now, contains a power to mandate interoperability, and very obviously the DMA does as well. So my question is, what would guide it in this new platform context? Since, nice though the 80s were, I seem to recall that Judge Green said he didn't want the AT&T breakup to be written on his tombstone. So by the same token, should we really be going back to the future?
So I guess I'll say interoperability has a number of advantages. You know, anytime you have network effects, they can either play out at the firm level in a market that lacks interoperability, or at the market level, right? And so in markets like email, right? I guess I don't know if email counts as the past at this point, but there you have like an interoperable network, and we all take for granted how effective it is to have interoperability playing out at the market level there. Of course, it also raises all sorts of challenges, and I think we could do probably entire panels about the challenges of interoperability in US telecom and the benefits of interoperability. I will say a couple of things in that regard. The 96 Telecommunications Act, I think more than Judge Green, I think of as, you know, setting forth a regime and, you know, one that yielded some benefits. I think some simple things, simple in retrospect, in telecom had huge advantages. So phone number portability and phone number interoperability, which we take for granted in the telecommunications context, right? That's the reason wireless emerged with multiple competitors. But you could also see ecosystems developing where those rules aren't in place, and a gatekeeper may have an interest in restraining those things in order to discourage switching and what have you. And so I guess in answer to your question with maybe some complexity, I don't have all the answers, but hopefully I double-clicked a little bit for you.
I have a question to Michal, and yeah, maybe also David, if there is time. I'm just wondering. So this is a panel on competition, but we never heard. We haven't discussed collusion. Do you think that generative AI is more or less likely to lead or to facilitate collusion in the markets and maybe also has something to do with the probability that collusion can be detected by competition authorities.
Thank you. This is a great question. And although I'm a competition law scholar in most days, I admit I have not thought, I've still not given a lot of thought to the question of whether generative AI is different from other algorithms in the sense that it can generate collusion or coordination, which is, of course, a significant problem in other regards. Much depends on several factors, and I will build here on what I know with regard to algorithmic collusion and in other spheres. So first is the transparency of the algorithm to other competitors, whether they know or not how the algorithm operates. And the second is the transparency of the data set on which the algorithm is trained and also operated. So for example, if you take a simple case where all the users use the same algorithm and the same data set, they will create the same answer, or it will generate a same answer to the exact same query. So there are very simple things that, I mean, but this is a very simple scenario. In more sophisticated or complex scenarios where you have different LLMs or different data sets, I don't think that the LLMs will create by themselves coordination. There are different from, for example, algorithms where you simply give the algorithm the task of generate the best price for me, and then it might lead to collusion.
And maybe I'll just layer on briefly. I think it's a great question. Thinking a little bit more broadly than just generative AI and, things you might define slightly different as sort of algorithmic AI tools. I think competition enforcers ought to be very focused on the potential in two respects. So you mentioned collusion. I think of that in the actual coordination, like concerted action between firms that is like price fixing or what have you. That's certainly a concern that algorithms could enable that. I also think that algorithmic AI can increase the likelihood of tacit coordination, right? So not what I would think strictly speaking of as collusive behavior, but just firms engaging in that sort of observable and reaction approach that increases the exercise of market power. And one of the things our revised merger guidelines mention is how if we see that in play in an industry, that increases the relative risk of coordinated effects that you might infer from an increase in concentration.
Thank you, Wolfgang. This is a wonderful question and extremely important, I would say, here. And the short answer is that it does not solve all the principal agent problems. It might even strengthen some of them under some conditions. But the long answer is that it depends on the conditions. So I can think about different conditions where LLMs compete with each other, where and none of them have significant market power, where the principal agent problem might be limited because they have the incentives to provide the best deal. Otherwise, consumers will move, will change their preferences of the LLM that they're using. The more difficult situations are those in which an LLM has market power, and it might have market power in a local sense or over a whole market. And there you have the concern of self-preferencing, and the self-preferencing might even be very hard to determine or to find out, because an output can be governed by heuristics or an AI filter, for example, trained classifiers, and not only by the model's parameters. And such filtering can, of course, be a way to create good things like combat misinformation, but it can also amount to self-preferencing, causing the model to emphasize or ignore sets of potential outputs in response to specific prompts. So again, the market can solve part of it, but not all of it. And here I think that a regulation plays an important part. And I think that what we have learned about self-preferencing and the tools that we have created, whether through competition law or through direct regulation like the DMA, I'm not saying that the DMA is perfect, it's far from perfect, but I'm saying that some of the issues that arose there and created solutions are relevant here as well. And this is maybe connected to a general point here, which I think that in many ways, generative AI is not very different from our other markets. And for example, I really liked David's work, which showed how telecommunication, what we learned from telecommunication is carried over. And I think that's true with regard to many other things. The interesting part here is that it maybe, you could say, it puts some of these effects on steroids, okay? And so it creates a combination, a synergy, a complexity of issues that we see in other places here, and we have to deal with them. But some of the tools are out there, and what we've learned about other contexts with regard to self-preferencing or principal agent problem are, of course, relevant here as well.
Quick question. Short
Yeah,
answer.
question for Flavio. Just the way we've seen the AI microdata on companies, the divergence finding is robust. Everyone's finding the same thing. My question is, how's the OECD interpreting this? Because it seems there's two very different ways. One is this is evidence of a moat, that these companies are just not experiencing competition at all and they're still surviving. The other one is evidence of, for want of a better phrase, a kind of negative dynamic capability. That this is revealing that these companies were never really very good in the first place, but just suddenly when you drop AI on top of it, some companies accelerate away, and these other ones just flounder. Now, competitive economics is, and they should therefore die. How are you interpreting this, these findings?
Well, so the increasing divergence, I think the one of the interpretation that has been given, and Chiara is a key author of the paper around that, is evidence about a slowdown in diffusion, in the breakdown or a slowdown in the diffusion machine, with some firms that are at the top that continue innovating, productivity growth continues, while other firms that are more lagging behind, and these divergences being an indirect evidence of the extent to which frontiers technologies that are at the top diffuse in the rest of the firm population. And therefore, there is a key role for policymakers in this sense to boost absorptive capacity of these firms that are lagging behind, including through interventions oriented at boosting and fostering skills, which was one of the points that we have discussing about today. Then linking this with AI possibly requires a little bit more time, as the data show, let's say, a bit more forward lags in terms of productivity implications, as evidence I was mentioning is starting to emerge, and this is starting to be observed in the data. I was mentioning before the link between AI and productivity. What we see so far in one of the recent papers is indeed the evidence of higher productivity of firms, but not sure the extent to which, for most of the firms beyond developers, AI actually has an effect of increasing productivity, because we see a key role of all these complementary assets. Other digital technologies that firms use that are related to AI, the digital infrastructure proxied by high-speed broadband, and the skills, including not only ICT skills, but also a broader set of skills. Then, I mean, this is in line with the evidence on the J curve that was mentioned before. Possibly it may take time to see broader and bigger effects for the large part of the business population of AI use on productivity. This is evidence that comes before generative AI, and the data that are coming up probably will inform more around the evidence, including the more recent developments of the technologies. I was mentioning before, developers, for one country, we see that for developers, this is a group of firms for which the productivity returns seem to already materialize beyond this selection related to digitalization and past higher productivity. I don't know if this answers at least to some extent your question.
Thank you very much. What an insightful panel, what an insightful day, but we're not done yet with this session. Bonus questions. And I know you're the last one, so no worry, we'll start with David. We start, oh no, you're not the last one, the second one, of course, alphabetical order. David, first question, and this is basically linked to the algorithmic consumer concept, if you will. Let's assume Gen AI, can make autonomous decisions and purchase stuff, and assume Gen AI has a midlife crisis. And what regulations would you propose to manage their sudden purchases of sports cars and impromptu digital road trips?
Well, as someone who bought a convertible at 39, I'm not sure I have the answer. Maybe you just let him get the car.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, Flavio, then you're next. Imagine AIs start their own version of the OECD called AI-ECD. What's the first policy debate they have, and is it over who has the better algorithm?
What is the policy debate they have within this organization? And that was the next part?
What's the first policy debate they have? And is it over who has the better algorithm?
Well, I'm not quite sure about how to answer this question, but maybe it could be material for a prompt to a large language model, and you see what the answer is going to be there.
It was an excellent, of course, excellent reply, because, Michal, the question for you is, which of the bonus questions for David and Flavio was generated using ChatGPT? Do you have a guess?
Both.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much. It was great. Thank you.